All right. Hello. Welcome to the third and final lecture of the 2025 Julian J. Rothbaum Distinguished Lectureship on Representative Government. On behalf of the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center and the Rothbaum family, I want to thank you for your attendance at this biennial event. I know there's a lot going on campus today, so I'm especially happy that folks showed up today for the third lecture. We sponsor this lectureship to bring together scholars, students, and citizens to nurture the values of a representative democracy. Through our mission and our center programs, we strive to strengthen representative democracy through engaged and informed citizens. I'm gonna have some notes here. I wanna note that we're gonna have a hard stop at 4:45 today. Our speaker is gonna be whisked to the airport, and we're all gonna have some happy thoughts that she makes her flight. So we hope to have some time for Q&A, but if we don't, we're just going to have that hard stop. Now, I want to thank some folks for participating in the activities this week. I want to thank Professor Carla Pratt and Alex Pearl from the OU College of Law, who participated in a roundtable yesterday. So it was a great conversation. So thank you to them for participating. I want to thank the students and staff at the Carl Albert Center for all the work they put into this event. So let's take a moment to thank Catherine McRae. It's her birthday today. I'm just gonna read all the names because we got a hard stop. Kristen McMurray, Kay Blanc, Nathan Barron, Nate Reeves, Peter Olson, Joy Rhodes, Derek Bixler, Jackson Ivester, John V. Patel, Lisa Inabati, Randy Wright, Alex Ariano, and Faith Martin. So thank them for all of their work. I want to thank Joel Jankowski, who had to go back to Washington, D.C. this morning, but for his continued support of this lecture series and the center in general. Joel's vision and efforts over the years have made this lectureship one of the best in the country. So thank you, Joel, if you're watching us online. And finally, I want to thank our lecturer for all of her hard work. In addition to these 3 lectures, Professor Blackhawk participated in 2 working lunches, recorded a podcast this morning, served on a roundtable at the law school, and then was at the dinner and served at the panel last night. So thank you, Professor Blackhawk, for all your work this week. I do warn our speakers before they agree that there's a lot of work. All right, this lecture series, established in 1983 with an endowment gift by his wife Irene and son Joel Jankowski, serves to promote ideals that Julian Rothbaum held dear in his own life and that the Carl Albert Center seeks to achieve in all its efforts. The details of Julian's life and commitment to service are captured in your program, and many of you have already heard me discuss his contributions to OU. I just want to restate the important principles in Julian Rothbaum's life. First is the importance of education, which enhances the quality of participation in political affairs. The second is the cultivation of public service and future political leaders. And finally, the broad-based engagement of private citizens in public affairs. So the center is proud to host its 22nd Rothbaum lecture, Maggie Blackhawk. Professor Blackhawk is a member of the Fond du Lac Band of the Lake Superior Ojibwe and teaches federal Indian law, constitutional law, and scholarship. And her scholarship explores the relationship between law and power, with an emphasis on ways subordinated peoples leverage law to shift power to their communities, especially outside of rights and courts-based framework. Her recent project focuses on the laws and legal histories of American colonialism and the central role of the American Colonial Project, including the resistance and advocacy of Native and other colonized peoples in shaping the constitutional law and history of the United States. So today's lecture is titled The Erasure of American Empire, the Cold War, and the Boomerang of Empire. So Professor Blackhawk, the podium is yours.
Okay. And can you all hear me? The microphone? Okay, just in case it didn't stop working in the middle. So thank you once again to Mike Crespin, to the Carl Albert Center, to the Jankowski and Rothbaum families. It really has been a wonderful treat, if not a marathon, to give these lectures. So my final lecture is on the erasure of American empire, the Cold War, and the boomerang of empire. So thus it was that at some point, before Pitkin published the concept of representation in 1967, the field of colonial administration, even the inclination to study colonial government as central to the study of government and political science, was abandoned. The once robust science and practice of governing others, colonial government, was now summarily condemned as fascism. As this erasure progressed, awareness of colonialism and colonial government, the existence of ongoing colonial administration, and even the history of the relationship between colonialism and the field of political science was erased with it. The practice of governing others was now no longer worthy of separate consideration or analysis, especially in the context of representative government, because these acts were simply fascist and held no meaningful place in the study of government, especially American government, which, according to Pitkin, was usually regarded as representative. The erasure of the study and science of colonialism took with it seemingly the ability to see Native and other territorial peoples, paradigmatic populations colonized by the United States. When Pitkin drafted the concept of representation, the United States was undergoing yet another sea change in colonial administration, shifting certain territorial governments towards forms of self-determination, like Puerto Rico's ambiguous Commonwealth status, and efforts to claim colonial constitutional government by other islands like American Samoa. Shifting other territorial governments like Hawaii and Alaska towards integration through statehood, with the apparatus of colonial administration explicitly shifted into the jurisdiction of state governments upon admission to the Union. Yet other Native colonial enclaves were part of the so-called, quote, termination era efforts to shift colonial administration from the federal government to state and nonprofit administration as a quiet yet incomplete effort toward decolonization during the Cold War era. So to be clear, since Pitkin's time, the US has undergone similar waves of change in colonial policy. For Indian country, these waves began with the advocacy of Native nations and Native peoples for self-determination. Today, the United States recognizes 574 tribal governments, including Alaska Native villages and corporations, and maintains a government-to-government relationship with each of these nations. Current US colonial policy supports these governments in forming their own constitutions, building their own governments, managing their own public infrastructure, and making their own laws. Many of these governments govern lands that are larger than several states. But it restricts these nations in myriad ways also, including restricting their power to govern within their own jurisdictions by limiting their power over non-Native people, and outside of their own jurisdictions by limiting their power extraterritorially, and by limiting their powers to form treaties, control their own systems of immigration, and build their own nation. Publication of Pitkin's concept of representation worked a sea change of its own within political science and its study of representative government, providing what many saw as a comprehensive framework for understanding representation. Scholars, most famously the great Jenny Mansbridge, who's also on the left, and the young Jenny Mansbridge, have built upon and clarified Pitkin's framework. But none have actually pressed the framework to better capture the breadth, depth, and history of American governance within its theorization. Instead, even within these four capacious categories, the erasures remain. Political scientists occasionally attempt to fit Native and other colonized people into Pitkin's existing framework. By treating only the aspect of colonialism that involves racialization, they most often analyze indigeneity as a racial category, and they look towards descriptive representation, for example. Scholars will ask how representative US officials are of Native people, and how Native officials being elected into the US government can descriptively represent Native people on their behalf, seemingly without recognizing the fact that they're analyzing without reflection or nuance whether a citizen of a colonized community can represent their people by serving in an elected capacity in the colonizing government. They erase those interim structures of government entirely. This is not to say that a colonial government can never represent colonized people, but the simplified models and theories operating behind the analysis obscure the complexity of the questions being asked. They obscure colonialism entirely, those formal structures of government. The fit will always be an awkward and incomplete one without further refinement of these fundamental categories in the first instance. Theorists of politics have also read these erasures, including Pitkin's erasures of the centrality of non-representative government within the making of the United States, back into our past, creating an ever greater chasm between political science's scientific study of government through the lens of what we imagine our current nation state to be, and the reality of how American expansion, colonization, and imperial administration were actually central to the formation and ongoing existence of the US as a nation. The founders of the discipline of political science, like Burgess and Albert Bushnell Hart, the author of this text and the description of the spiritization of American history, recognized that these events were central to the formation of the United States. They recognized that these events could actually form the heart of American history. These theories, doctrines, and structures of government were ones that aimed at homogenizing, incorporating, and unifying populations rather than representing them. And these dynamics did more to actually make the United States that we live with today than representative government and representative governing structures. So the chasm between the field of political science and the reality of American colonialism has grown so large that political scientists have noticed the erasure. For example, Perspectives on Politics published a reflection symposium about a decade ago with an opening essay by Professor Kenan Ferguson titled simply, "Why Does Political Science Hate American Indians?" A question for my own sake that I hope is rhetorical. Symposium respondents largely identified the cause of the erasure of Native people in two disciplinary problems. First, an overemphasis in political science on the nation state. And second, an underemphasis of the study of marginalized peoples outside of formal governing structures. So these critiques of political science could be valid. They likely are. But reflecting on nearly a century of study and practice in colonial administration, as we did yesterday, begs the question, are colonized people, including Native people, really, quote, outside of formal governing structures? On the slide, you'll see the flow chart that students in my class of federal Indian law are handed so that they might make sense of which government has jurisdiction over a criminal incident in any particular case happening within Indian country. This is how they decide which government gets to govern it. I remain amazed at the dearth of study of federal Indian law within US law schools nationwide. Because if you printed the hundreds of treaties, reams of regulations, full titles of the US Code, not to mention the hundreds of tribal constitutions, tribal codes, state regulations, and you dropped those documents on every law dean's desk, the flood alone might help them understand that Indian country is one of the most heavily regulated jurisdictions in America. Indian country is one of the most heavily regulated jurisdictions in the United States because these jurisdictions are subject to so many formal governing structures simultaneously. Native and other colonized people aim to be farther, quote, outside of formal governing structures than they are. Instead, to the extent that so-called jurisdictional vacuums exist within Indian country, they're more often due to the overlap of multiple formal systems of government, including a range of colonial and native governments, and the complexity wrought by this overlap than to the absence of formal governing structures. It's hard to decide who gets to govern because so many institutions are governing. Similarly, symposium participants raised political science's singular focus on the nation state as a reason for Native erasure. Ferguson describes how the study of Native people falls outside the frame of comparative politics because Native people are simply too domestic. And yet they also fall outside of political theory and American politics because the state is the primary unit of analysis in these fields, such that sub-state and non-state actors, even those with sovereignty, disappear from consideration. But again, turning to the founding texts in the field of political science begs the question, are Native and other colonized peoples not central to the study of a nation state? Are the bureaucratic apparatuses, legal frameworks, and other distinctive forms of government all far too massive and complex for the populations they now govern? Aren't these at the very heart of the nation? Father of American political science, William Burgess, certainly thought so. The need for a nation to have a, quote, colonial policy was central to the nation's functions. That is the stabilization of its borders and the unification of its people. Burgess understood that nations were not solely inward-looking projects. He understood and conceptualized nation as a more capacious project than the government or state that the nation built to govern its existing population. The project of nation included also the principles and processes for locating and defining borders through expansion, annexation, and colonization, for example, and for deciding who belonged within those borders, who constituted the central political community and who did not. Because Burgess saw these aspects of nation as central to the formation and stabilization of the United States, he also saw those aspects of the government built to implement these principles and policies as a central aspect of government. Burgess also understood that the idea of nation would necessarily include central questions of how to resolve problems of heterogeneity within the nation, as well as nearby. He also offered answers: representative government for some, and despotic government for others who strayed too far from that national vision. Burgess's answers to these central questions, his solutions to these problems may have been anachronistic, even wrong for his time, but at least he saw these questions as central and as worth asking. Nation to Burgess was not a taken for granted conclusion. One singular people governed under an established government. This was assumed. To Burgess, nation was an ongoing process. Arguments for unification or separation, or principles that would guide those processes, including setting national borders, defining the central political community, and even for homogenization of that political community through colonial administration. Because the formation and the maintenance of nation involve these processes, Burgess understood that the state must take particular forms. Scholars of political science and colonial administration that followed him accepted that the state would include non-uniform, unrepresentative, and even despotic governance in certain instances. These aspects of the state were not ancillary to representative government, they were central to it. Representative government that requires alignment, that presumes an alignment between polity and representative, is thus dependent on those principles and forms of government developed to create that alignment. You need to force it down unless you have structures to build out and actually incorporate diverse perspectives. Under Burgess's definition of nation, Native and other colonized people are at the heart of the study of that nation state and of theories of representative government because they are the edge of the nation becoming. They are an integral part of the process of nation, even if governed under certain aspects of the state that are not representative. This is why for Mill and Burgess, and for the field of colonial administration that followed in their footsteps, study of colonial policy or the governing of colonized people was just as central to the study of government as representative government itself, because these were the principles and processes that the nation state had identified as how best to build its political community, as well as how best to create that alignment and equal dignity necessary for self-government in the first instance. No doubt the views of these early political scientists are clouded by their biases against the people they colonized. To Mill, Burgess, and others, Native peoples were not simply different from national populations. They were inferior. Linguistically, religiously, culturally, and eventually biologically. But the biases of these scholars did not blind them to the realities of modern European and American government, and to the complex relationship between national formation and state formation through which they lived firsthand. Even amidst these biases, or perhaps even because they weren't blind to these biases, founders of the field of political science and their vision for the science of politics captured the realities of nation more accurately than modern theorists like Pitkin, and the incomplete empiricism on which these modern narrow theories of nation and representation rest. These founders better understood that theories of representation cannot presume stable borders, homogeneous populations, and an alignment between polity and representative. Theories of representation cannot simply condemn government outside of that alignment as fascism and just move on. Rather, such theories must also interrogate and define the limits of alignment between polity and representative, as well as the principles that define who the polity is in the first instance, including representative government must tackle with misalignment just as much as it tackles with alignment. Should the representative government and polity shift to be more inclusive and accepting of diverse and plural peoples? Or should those peoples be recognized as independent governments or afforded other forms of self-determination because the alignment is too far off? Because political science no longer asks these questions, the answers of early generation, as abhorrent as they are, remain in place. They are no doubt reasons for erasing these shameful periods of racialization and hierarchies of civilization from the canon of political science. To reintroduce the study of these governing frameworks and the biases that motivated them risks reinscribing the principles embraced by those past generations. It risks normalizing what came to be known as fascism and what was ended in the ultimate forms of constitutional, governing, and human rights failures of modern human memory. This is no doubt what Richard Hofstadter aimed to do with his pointed 1944 publication of Social Darwinism in American Thought, a book that Hofstadter made clear was written during the war, but published thereafter. He swept up the work of Burgess and others within the currents of Darwin's evolutionary theories. He had them defined by the scientific racism and eugenics movements that followed under claims of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority. Again, no doubt these critiques of racialization and racism within these theories and their theorists was warranted. But Hofstadter's focus on racism as the sole structuring mechanism for these early theories overlooks the ways that colonial government and colonial administration had operated along lines of linguistic, religious, and cultural superiority long before the technology of race and racialization joined the toolkit of colonial administration. His focus on racism also backgrounds the longstanding theories of government, governance, representation, and liberal principles that had developed hand in glove with colonial governance and colonial administration. I could say more on the erasure of colonial government from the idea of nation, but in my lecture today, I'd like to turn my remarks to explore in greater depth what political science has lost because of this erasure. And further, what we all lose when the primary field studying government within the United States cannot see the realities of American history and ongoing aspects of our own government. In my remarks, I will, rather than decrying or celebrating these earlier periods that saw the governance of others as worthy of a distinct theorization and scientific inquiry, offer some thoughts about how the study of these fields and their development might broaden our horizons regarding the study and theorization of contemporary American government today. In the interest of time, I'll focus today on two of the likely many examples. First, I'll explore how the science of colonial administration offered expertise to reformers interested in decolonization. and how the study of these complex and long-standing systems of colonial administration allowed reformers to better see those structures of colonial government and to better understand how to undertake meaningful forms of decolonization. Second, I'll explore the ways that an understanding of the field of colonial administration, and especially its history, could better position political scientists and perhaps all of us to see the breadth and scope of political and governance challenges facing the United States today. 1, decolonization. At the time Ralph Bunche was admitted to Harvard University for graduate study on a full-ride scholarship, he hadn't ever lived on the East Coast. He hadn't lived outside of Los Angeles, California for about a decade. Although Bunche had spent his younger years in his birthplace of Detroit, Michigan, and then Albuquerque, New Mexico, he spent formative years of adolescence and early adulthood within the particular racial landscape of South Central Los Angeles, where he was raised by his grandmother, and in Westwood at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he was raised by the field of political science. He had been valedictorian of every class that had graduated him, from high school to college, and he was steeling himself for a new challenge, graduate training in political science at Harvard University. One of his earliest forms of preparation was to write Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois by letter on May 11th, 1927. On UCLA letterhead, Bunche notified Du Bois of his academic achievements to date, and he notified him of his plan for the future, which was, quote, rather definitely formed, to undertake graduate work at Harvard. His concern at the time was the, quote, race problem in America, and his goals were to tackle this broader problem in terms of graduate study and with any employment that might come his way. Hence the occasion for the letter and his ask of Du Bois for a position at the NAACP. It's unclear whether Du Bois responded to Bunche that summer, but their paths were on such similar trajectories that they would likely cross again over and over throughout their careers. Importantly, both men undertook similar forms of training within the fields of politics and colonial administration within the program established at Harvard. During Du Bois's tenure, he was mentored by the historian and political scientist Albert Bushnell Hart, who would go on to found the first political science department at Harvard in 1912, before then hiring Frederick Jackson Turner to head the history department. Hart was one of 2 scholars teaching American history at Harvard in the late 19th century, and he was the primary motivator behind building the field of colonial administration at Harvard University. He would go on to serve both as president of the American Historical Association and the American Political Science Association, illustrating his views regarding the ongoing overlap of the fields. But he was at times even more focused on colonial government and colonial administration than his colleague Burgess had been. Du Bois's dissertation, approved in 1895, studied the suppression of the African slave trade in the United States of America, 1683 to 1871. Styled as a legal and administrative history, Du Bois surveyed the forms of colonial administration established by Britain before the Revolution to manage the international slave trade. And then he documented a range of efforts to reform that system of administration through duties and other administrative reforms, ultimately documenting the failure of those administrative reforms to wholly resolve the abomination of human enslavement. Where Du Bois studied colonial administration comparatively across the history of North America, from the British to the Americans. Nearly 40 years later, Bunche would arrive at Harvard, and then quickly depart again to found the sociology department at Howard University. When he returned from his leave of absence to Harvard, he quickly set sail under the direction of scholar of colonial administration, Professor Raymond Leslie Buell, to study comparatively the forms of colonial administration in Dahomey, a French colony, and Togoland, a colony that had just transitioned from German to French control under the newly established mandate system of the League of Nations. Buell had published a path-breaking 2-volume work on, quote, the native problem in Africa, which surveyed colonial administration across the continent and had become the primary treatise on African colonial government. Bunch planned to follow in his footsteps. He went on to craft a prize-winning dissertation on comparative colonial administration, becoming the first Black American to be awarded a doctorate in political science. His dissertation began with the sentence, "Imperialism is a policy of conquest." Bunch would dedicate his life to reforming the forms of colonial administration that he studied at his time at Harvard. By applying the methodologies of the field, comparative, deep, and historical legal and political histories of government, he was able to see that the forms of government instituted under the League of Nations mandate system were actually nearly identical to the forms of colonial government and colonial administration instituted without it. Systems of colonial government, now allegedly reformed under a formal international legal framework, had merely retrenched colonial administration under a new name. Not satisfied with the academic study of colonial government, Bunch would eventually serve in the US State Department during World War I. And from there, he joined a delegation that would ultimately found the United Nations and draft its charter. Central to Bunch's work on the reform of colonial government was Chapter 11 of the United Nations Charter, the Declaration Regarding Non-Self-Governing Territories. A declaration that would, at least in part, motivate the United States to begin to decolonize in ways both symbolic and substantive following World War II. The declaration inspired the final launch of the Philippine Islands towards independence. It inspired the creation whole cloth of the ambiguous and often critiqued status of Commonwealth for Puerto Rico, and pressure toward the compact relationship for the trust territories, as well as a range of other reforms of self-determination that were inspired in the latter half of the 20th century. Bunch's training in colonial administration allowed him to see the ways that colonial governments merely transform in name only, while retaining those features that entrench it, leading him to bring light worldwide and ultimately within the United States of these ongoing forms of colonial government. However, the light shined on American colonialism brought by the Declaration quickly went out. America of the Cold War era became the enemy of colonialism rather than its administrator. And American exceptionalism took hold, including the redefinition of nation and the reformulation of the field of political science, one that no longer saw the long and complex history of colonial administration. This was simply fascism. With the loss of the study of colonial administration went with it the ability to identify, study, and analyze forms of colonial government in the United States. The irony is that were Ralph Bunch alive in 2015, he could have applied the methods of colonial administration to study the government of Puerto Rico comparatively through its own history, as both a colony or territory and as a commonwealth. Applying these methods, he likely would have quickly identified that the forms of government afforded Puerto Rico as a commonwealth differed in name only from the forms of government it had been afforded as a territory or a colony. The legal framework of Commonwealth and Public Law 600 had actually been developed by another colonial administrator who would later turn Supreme Court Justice Abraham Fortas, who is depicted on the slide. Bunch might have reflected on reforms to the colonial administration of Puerto Rico that afforded more generous terms of self-determination, but he would have still defined the government of Puerto Rico by the United States as colonial. The U.S. reviewed and approved its constitution, designed its system of government, and federal law applied by fiat across the island, foreclosing their ability to regulate their people nationally. Shortly thereafter, Bunch would have been proven right when in 2016, all three branches of the US government, including the Obama administration, would declare openly that Puerto Rico was once again a colony. And that because the US had wholly conquered the Puerto Rican government at the time of US occupation, it didn't have sovereignty, as the Supreme Court declared. Thus, the U.S. had full constitutional power to intervene in Puerto Rico's government, including by appointing government by commission. staffed by commissioners not elected or accountable to the people of Puerto Rico, but appointed by the President of the United States. Beyond determining whether a government is reformed or not, colonial or not, expertise in the field of colonial administration would have a range of unforeseen benefits for the study of American politics and political institutions today. The United States continues to assert the power to colonize and govern others. It administers hundreds of colonial governments through a range of forms of delegated colonial administration. By statute and regulation, the U.S. administers the governments of native nations, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and the U.S. imposes U.S. law, norms, and constitutional values upon these peoples without their consent. Congress has developed intricate plans for colonial government that allow colonies from Indian country to Puerto Rico the ability to self-determine and to make law under constitutions crafted by their own colonized peoples, so long, of course, as those constitutions are approved by the United States. The Secretary of the Interior reviews, approves, and rejects constitutions for these governments. It calls, administers, and reviews their elections, and it reviews tribal codes and territorial codes. Scores of treaties, reams of regulations, and 2 full titles of the U.S. Code, which you can see on the slide, structure the relationship between these subordinated governments and the government that purports to exercise plenary power over them. Congress also determines when the colonial relationship ends. It has developed a decade-long plan before granting conditional independence to the Philippines, and it has established a variety of colonial relationships, like that of the Commonwealth or Trust Territory, that remain operative today. But experts in the legal frameworks and structures of government of American colonialism are still few and far between. Most law schools, especially those considered elite, offer nothing more than a single class in federal Indian law, and that's often taught by an adjunct faculty member, and even fewer offer classes on the laws and governing frameworks of the territories. As I've written elsewhere, these governments, as well as the histories of expansion and colonization, have little to no place within the paradigmatic understanding of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution of American colonialism was erased alongside that science of colonial administration. So why should political scientists, if legal scholars don't, study colonialism, colonial government, and colonial administration? Expertise in this area could offer a range of benefits, I argue, to your discipline. First, it could build a scientific and rigorous empirical study of the laws, legal histories, and forms of colonial government within the United States, comparatively through American history and across jurisdictions previously treated as wholly disparate. Second, in comparing these forms of colonial administration, scholars can bring to the fore forms of colonial administration that have been successful in supporting self-determination and even independence. And at the very least, these can be used to avoid the worst forms of subordination and violence. For example, it's never been clear to me why Native nations have been afforded greater forms of self-determination, including the ability to administer their own colonial administration through hiring preferences for tribal citizens into the Bureau of Indian Affairs, than have the island colonies. Further, Native nations and peoples have seemingly been afforded more flexible causes of action to bring lawsuits, challenging negligent forms of colonial administration. Importantly, and finally, expertise in colonial administration could provide a teleology to the current system of colonial government within the United States, a system that has no clear future, given the inability of legal and political elites, even the discipline of American politics and political development, to see it as part of American government. Ralph Bunche understood that the path to decolonization led through information, expertise, and study of the colonial governments and relationships that were entrenched globally. It's difficult to even identify what is a colonial government and what kind of government would become truly independent and representative, ridding itself of the primary features of traditional colonial administration without learning those forms of government in the first instance. The study of colonial government and administration is, of course, premised on its recognition and greater empirical awareness. Comparative historical study of these forms of government and recognition of their ongoing nature could begin a conversation on the process to wholly reform or even decolonize the United States. We must study a thing, understand its past and present, to remedy it, reform it, and hopefully wholly resolve it. Governing others without their consent and through force, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike should be antithetical to our constitutional order. Many would say that it already is. But because we lack the recognition that the US has always governed others through force, we lack the language to begin to work through measures of repair, reform, and decolonization. Instead, the US has policies of termination and self-determination without awareness, even by brilliant scientists of government like Hannah Pitkin, that these policies are unstructured and flailing efforts towards decolonization. These are incomplete measures to dismantle the colonial administrative structures of decades, if not hundreds of years past. The boomerang. Scholars of colonialism, most notably Aimé Césaire and Hannah Arendt, have identified the ways in which the colonial structures of government by force, coercion, and institutionalized violence often naturally return, like the physics of a boomerang, to govern the people of the metropole. To Arendt, colonialism begets totalitarian government everywhere. This phenomenon is one Césaire termed the boomerang effect of colonialism. Theorists like Césaire and Arendt understood that because colonies are often used as intentional laboratories of innovation for forms of government and social control, those policies return to influence the government of the metropole as well as the colony. Further, even when it's not so intentional, colonial governments are led by government and military leaders who operate as their own unintentional boomerang as they return home to lead their governments after governing the colonies. And they bring their techniques, their lessons, even their forms of trauma and disturbance developed within the colonial heart of darkness with them. The process of colonization transforms the colonizer as much as the colonized. Theorization of the boomerang effect has largely been developed in the context of Nazi Germany and the boomerang of authoritarianism that returned from German imperialism and the stripping of German colonies following World War I. No doubt the relationship between colonial administration and Nazi Germany deserves greater study. But the boomerang effect of American colonialism upon the formation and operation of US government deserves a central place in the field of political science also. I will close my remarks today with a discussion of two examples of the boomerang effect of American empire, highlighting the ways that the study of colonial government and administration, including its history, could assist scholars of government in identifying boomerang effects on US government. The first example, the boomerang of authoritarianism or authoritarian structures of government, is more paradigmatic, fitting snugly within those critical theories of the boomerang offered by Arendt and Césaire. The second example, the boomerang of administration and administrative law, presses on their theories to allow scholars of government to see the impacts of colonialism beyond those authoritarian structures. These laboratories of government, however oppressive, may still have given rise to innovations of government that are beneficial, even ideal. But as I'll highlight, understanding these structures of government as having been created within the context of empire remains important, especially in better identifying their nuances and potentially their weaknesses. But first, authoritarianism. Talk of authoritarian government is in the news. And like Arendt and Césaire, political scientists and commentators in the US tend to look for examples of those authoritarian governments from elsewhere, most paradigmatically, Nazi Germany. Rarely do scholars of American government turn their frame of authoritarian analysis back to the United States for examples of unbridled executive and military power and government through force and violence. Perhaps they're references to human enslavement and the Jim Crow era, but inevitably analogies of authoritarian government seem to better fit, for example, those from abroad than at home. Bringing the history of American colonialism, colonial government, and colonial administration into the theorization of US government could provide examples of what forms of authoritarianism might take root, for lack of a better word, indigenously within the United States. Returning to the Louisiana Purchase example from my first lecture, in 1803, the United States took possession of almost 530 million acres of land, nearly doubling the size of the country. And at this time, questions arose about what forms of constitutionalism, what fundamental principles and values would govern that expansion. Would a process of liberal constitutionalism govern that process? Would peoples within the new lands deliberate and consent to governance through ratification of a constitutional amendment? Would the peoples of the original constitutional order consent to these additions of these new lands and peoples? Was there even constitutional power to acquire these lands and to bring these peoples into the polity through a treaty that didn't ever actually involve them? From where did the power to govern these lands and peoples arise? Rather than apply lofty liberal constitutional principles, the Congress and the President instead turned to the blueprint for empire laid by the Northwest Ordinance and the powers they saw as inherent in all sovereign nations at the time, notably all of them empires, to acquire lands and expand by treaty and conquest, and to govern uncivilized peoples toward civilization. Shortly after ratifying the treaty with France that allowed them to take possession of those 530 million acres, Congress instead passed a statute authorizing the president to take possession of the area by force and employ any part of the Army and Navy to do so. Beyond authorizing the establishment of U.S. sovereignty and constitutional order through military might, the statute also delegated to the president to direct, quote, all of the military, civil, and judicial powers of the existing government, to establish for the territory an unrepresentative government, a top-down government. This was truly unitary, unilateral, and nearly unbridled forms of executive power. And the United States turned again and again to the blueprint for empire and its constitutional vision of powers inherent in sovereignty as it expanded across the West and beyond. In 1936, the United States Supreme Court, yet again, for not the first time, codified this vision of national power inherent in sovereignty into its constitutional doctrine, this time in a case involving the power of the president to regulate in the context of foreign affairs and war. Writing for the court, Justice George Sutherland described a constitutional order where the national government held powers that arose from the Constitution, as well as powers that arose from outside the Constitution, powers inherent in all sovereign nations, like treaty, war, foreign affairs, as well as the power to expand and colonize others. Amidst a growing effort by the Supreme Court to limit the power of the United States and even state governments to regulate the economy, Justice Sutherland had to somehow preserve that liberal constitutional order alongside the limitless presidential and congressional power that had fueled westward expansion and ultimately the creation of the nation in which he now lived. To do this, he described two distinctive forms of constitutional law within the United States. Internal constitutional law, and he uses the word internal, would operate the way that we all would expect, with limited national power arising from the Constitution, enforced by courts. For external matters, in contrast, the power of the president and the Congress included unwritten power that arose from sovereignty. And because these powers didn't arise from the Constitution, they seemingly were not limited by it also. Justice Sutherland had begun to craft his constitutional philosophy throughout his lifetime as he grew up in the territory of Utah, where he served. This is the recalcitrant territory of Utah that came back from my earlier lecture, for those who liked the joke, where he served as a territorial leader. George Sutherland had even published an essay on his vision of a dual constitutional order when he was serving in the Congress as senator for Utah after its admission to the Union. He understood the importance of the constitutional and legal framework that had established his recalcitrant territory, its territorial government, and had governed Native people within it, including unilaterally breaking up the Ouray Reservation without their consent. a process that Sutherland had supported when serving on the territorial government. Thus, the Supreme Court codified into constitutional doctrine this dual constitution, one with seemingly unlimited national political power over certain areas deemed, quote, external. Today, these areas of constitutional doctrine still exist across a range of substantive areas of constitutional law, so the blueprint for empire could be replicated. Scholars have been sounding the alarm for decades about the abuses that regularly arise in these areas singularly. But more recently, the current administration has turned to many of these areas, like its own blueprint for expansion of executive power, citing Curtis Wright directly, that Sutherland case, for inherent sovereign power over these areas of law, even beginning to stretch what is internal and what is external. It shouldn't surprise any of us that the National Guard was first called in the District of Columbia, for example, a remnant of these forms of territorial government, or that the government is defending the constitutionality of birthright citizenship by pointing to Native people citizenship status as precedent for its power. So you can see how areas like federal Indian law, immigration, territorial law, the powers of war and exigency, treaty power, foreign relations law, they're all described even today as areas that are exceptional, that are free from those constitutional restraints that we believe to exist in all forms of government power. They do not operate in the same way in these areas even today. Okay. The boomerang of administration. Scholars of government should not also limit themselves to looking for boomerang effects of American colonialism that are authoritarian in form. As the great Al McCoy and others have begun to document, forms of administrative government, from education to public health to environmental management, arose from US colonial policy that treated its colonies as laboratories of innovation in American government. So documenting the connections between forms of government and empire need not result in condemnation of those innovations or their abandonment. Often governments learn to govern through failure, and lessons learned about authoritarianism and resistance in the colonial context really do have much to teach us about how better to structure our government today. But there are still reasons to study the connection between these innovations and their roots in empire beyond that condemnation. Because of their origins, these forms of government could have unforeseen weaknesses and characteristics that are not yet identified. So returning to our example from yesterday of how the field of colonial administration quickly merged with public administration, administrative law, and informed the development of progressive ideas about the power and promise of technocratic government by bureaucracy. A bureaucracy that wasn't limited by the Constitution or substantive judicial oversight. These leaders, Felix Frankfurter, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and Frank Goodenow, all trained in colonial administration, often transitioning seamlessly between the academy, colonial administrative leadership, and domestic governance. They also saw the colonies as ideal grounds to develop their innovations in administrative government. The colonies were held apart from political tumult. They weren't restricted by representative government, nor did the Constitution or judicial review hold back the science and innovation of these thinkers. New Deal era thinkers and leaders, like Frank Murphy, trained in colonial administration and then brought their academic training, as well as the academy itself, as a brain trust to implement Little New Deal programs from Detroit to the Philippines to Michigan. As they moved between these jurisdictions, they often idealized the smoothness with which they were able to experiment within the colonies. And they sought to establish similar, efficient, and unlimited constitutional, governing, and legal conditions back home. This boomerang was not of fascism, but of innovation and utopianism. Colonial administrators returning home with their innovations sought not to subordinate, but to develop and lift up communities through the efficient science of government. They wanted to solve those large-scale public health problems, tackle tough environmental issues, and improved entrenched and deeply unequal conflicts over labor and capital. We have all benefited from these innovations as a society. So why study the connection between progressive administration, administrative law, and colonial administration at all? Again, aren't some histories better off forgotten? I'd offer that there may be unforeseen shortcomings in the translation of these forms of government from the colonial context to the domestic, ways in which these innovations in government and the legal and constitutional frameworks built around them could have weaknesses and issues that we might better understand if we understood their history and how this history has shaped them. For example, Felix Frankfurter, one of the most well-known progressive administrators, he also cut his teeth in colonial administration. When it was announced that he would join the faculty at Harvard Law School, his announcement celebrated his experience as the, quote, chief legal advisor for the colonial administration of the United States, a role that brought him before the Supreme Court for the first time, arguing constitutional cases on behalf of the government with respect to Puerto Rico and the Philippines. This position also afforded Frankfurter the experience of how quickly government could regulate issues in the absence of political and constitutional oversight. He drafted the labor code for the Panama Canal Zone almost single-handedly, for example. So when he became the foremost scholar of modern administrative law in the 20th century, he brought those lessons with him. He developed a constitutional and legal framework for administration that would not be limited by judicial review and constitutional oversight. These limitations would come from a professionalized civil service, internal legal standards that would be enforced internally, procedural regularity, public scrutiny, and an informed legal bar. The ethics and practices of these administrative institutions alone, to Frankfurter, would keep them in check and would afford the people regulated good, efficient scientific government solutions for their problems. Frankfurter's innovative vision of administration largely succeeded. From the regulation of labor, the environment, public health, industry, administrative government has largely helped those to solve those problems of civilization. Frankfurter's boomerang of empire has benefited rather than harmed the metropole. But questions remain whether Frankfurter's vision of administration, one born in the context of unilateral, even despotic forms of government, properly protects against abuse, or whether it was developed in a context where abuse was overlooked or even taken for granted. As we're seeing today, the legal and constitutional framework to structure and limit bureaucracy doesn't always hold, and it can be transformed very quickly into a tool of subordination by an expansive and imperial presidency. And when these individuals take over, individuals who embrace expansive visions of executive power rather than a professional civil service limited by science and their disciplinary training, these administrative apparatuses quickly shift toward unaccountable, top-down forms of government yet again. Or when the public or the legal bar fails to understand the lengths to which administration could be turned towards subordination and social control, we've forgotten the history of these institutions. What then? Studying the history of colonial administration at least might help us identify the colonial boomerang in our midst. Perhaps this identification comes too late to actually stop it. But at the very least, we might understand our own government and what it is truly capable of, so we can better understand how to limit it in the future. To know how our own institutions came into being is to understand what they were designed to do, and just as crucially, what they were not designed to prevent. If empire taught the state how to govern swiftly and efficiently without consent or representation, then scholars of American government must better understand how to limit that power without paralyzing it. And if we're to preserve a system of representative government, one that genuinely serves the people rather than subjugates them, then we must be willing to confront the colonial shadows that linger within our present government. I'll end my remarks there, but thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. And there should be a microphone. We do have a few minutes if you'd like to talk about.
Thank you so much for your comments and all of your lectures. This has been really great learning about it. You've talked a bit about what you wish political scientists would do in this space. My PhD is in political science, but my subfield's in public administration. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about that part of it. Like what is the space where you think public administration scholars could really make a contribution here? Because I already see a lot of ways that it would help us change our focus, but in terms of what to do next, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Yes. No. So Alistair Roberts' work, if you're not familiar with it, is foundational in really tracing this history, or beginning to trace this history between colonial administration and public administration. I think in the context of public administration in particular, studying its own history of colonial administration, trying to understand where some of those presumptions come from around technocratic government, why the presumptions exist around judicial review and similar for like a wariness of constitutional limit, why we even call it administrative law or administration at all versus something else. This is governance. The reason that Goodnow and others initially tried to separate and even create administrative government and governance and law as a wholly separate inquiry was to hold it separate from those principles of government that they saw elsewhere, that they saw as limiting. And so to bring those histories together, to understand that the separation was one that was intentional, both to develop fields of colonial administration at the same time that they were looking towards domestic administration, and to look at those presumptions that were founded in the problems of the era, of the limitations of the colonial context. In thinking that the people on the other side couldn't take part in this process because they were too savage. And also, interestingly and importantly, public administration has much to learn from the way that colonial administration has continued. Those forms of accountability, the ways that Indian country, for example, has taken over its administrative apparatus and has empowered local communities and empowered those peoples to be able to govern by taking over those systems. That's an accountability mechanism. There was a fight before the IRA where Native peoples were trying to fight to get a hire and fire mechanism for their Indian agent. So again, we're seeing today these moments where the bureaucracy is essentially gone on its own route, and we wish we could check it. We wish the notice and comment process actually worked. We wish there was a petition process that actually reins in some of these forms of operations. You can learn that in a colonial context while also understanding why some of the limits have come in that we're starting to see, and that those limits were presumed from people who wanted to have the smoothness of colonialism in their innovative administration. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for the question.
Hello, I really appreciated your talk today. I would like to ask, you used the word fiat when it came to control over Puerto Rico. What do you mean by fiat? I'm not very familiar with that term.
Yes. So fiat in that context had to do specifically with how we apply our legal system to another country. So it's sort of like if we woke up one day and Congress passed a statute that all of the US code would apply to Canada. That's what it did to Puerto Rico.
So I had a quick question. Earlier today, I was speaking with Peter, and we were talking actually about this sort of topic. How would you recommend implementing current colonial territories into like current analysis of like nation states? So how would you integrate them into the current study?
Yes. No, it's a great question. So one is rethinking the idea of nation, not presuming it. Don't presume stable populations. Don't presume stable borders. Understand that there must be a state process behind that stability that we're taking for granted. And we're seeing it unravel in certain ways. And so the moment where, we now have a government that is gesturing towards the Panama Canal Zone or other Canada, even speaking of Canada yet again, not to destine its future. But the gestures towards expansion are not new. I think everyone was a bit taken aback by the Panama Canal Zone, but perhaps it's in the memory of some here that we governed the Panama Canal Zone until very recently. And so we need to understand that nation requires those things, and that because we've presumed representation in the context of that stable nation, we're forgetting all of the processes that all of these other folks saw on the other side. They were abhorrent in the ways that they developed them, but they at least saw the fact that we had a system that just presumed alignment because we had forced alignment so many ways for so many years. And instead to start to theorize alignment as a form of representation, and to see misalignment as a space for innovation, and as the work of representative government, and maybe as another force within representation that needs to be accounted for. And then further, I think making sure that colonized people are placed within a structure that makes sense rather than forced within a structure that erases colonial governments. But I think also we have a conference that we're having on colonial administration. It's a broad interdisciplinary conference next month. And you're also welcome to come. It's comparative colonial administration, sociologists, historians, et cetera. People have been studying this for a very long time, but they're at the fringes of many fields and disciplines. And so we're trying to bring those conversations together. Graduate students are wonderful bringing togetherers. So trying to find people and start those conversations to where you can think about, gosh, why is there a non-voting delegate for the territories? Why was there a non-voting delegate for the territories before they became states? How about I have a wonderful project like a postdoc at Princeton who is documenting non-voting delegates and comparing them? Oh, yes.
So thank you again for the conversations. I wonder if you could speak to, and maybe this is a mutuals only kind of conversation, but I really, I feel like there's sort of a battle within the literatures and Indigenous studies right now for I don't ascribe to the nation building literature at all because of these conversations. They're inherently colonial. And if we are going to consider ourselves nations, then we have to be able and willing to deal with the consequences of that choice of those words. And I wonder if I prefer to study Indigenous communities as self-determining, and I mean, sovereignty in and of itself isn't an Indigenous concept. It's not our word. And that's, again, maybe going back to your conversation about colonial administration and representation via culture, religion, representation, going back to that, that's definitely much more authentic to an Indigenous way of knowledge, ways of being, right? But I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
No, it's a great question. So the should Native nations, especially given the fact that they've had to essentially formulate themselves as nations as a form of resistance to the colonial project, should we study it? Should we engage it? Should we critique it? It's a wonderful question, and I think uncovers how far we've come because it takes the conversation out of the defensive crouch of we are a nation, we are sovereign. I think it's really helpful to unpack where all of that language came from, both in terms of how marvelous it reveals the advocacy strategy and organizing strategies of Native people, organizing around power, around sovereignty. Sovereignty is a law of nations term, so it's a legal term of art, using the legal systems that were in power at the time to argue for a treaty and a government-to-government relationship to force back the colonial framework of the United States and other European nations. Self-determination, of course, is Woodrow Wilson's term, and Native nations codified into law, domestic law in the US, forms of self-determination that wouldn't be recognized today under international law. It was far more robust in the US, while self-determination fell off in the world in Adam Gedachow's work. It was entrenched in the US because of Native people fighting within those particular legal frameworks. Do I think that we need to push back beyond a defensive crouch form of advocacy? Always. Both as scholars, this is a real form of inquiry, but also because once we recognize these systems, once we understand the structures of them and what we're up against, we can understand the complexity of the governments that we're now having to form around forms of resistance, and to see those as forms of resistance. Last night, we talked about how Native nations have been so innovative. They have been so successful in their advocacy in a certain sense that we now don't see the colonial framework operating around them. Native nations are just sovereign. The US is not an empire. And that's a pretty amazing effort. I mean, it's not hard to erase colonialism, but I'll at least give Native nations that. So I think that embracing and understanding the nuances of the system in which we are operating, not trying to essentialize or overly celebrate the systems in which we're in. I see that in efforts to entrench, especially across Canada. They have classes in almost every law school on, quote, Indigenous law, as if the law of Native people being made in Canada are the law that they would make by themselves if they were left to themselves, rather if they were not colonized by Canada. We need to see those structures so we can push past them, both the restrictions of them as well as the defensive crouch of, living within the resistance, living within the struggle. We need to allow ourselves to imagine, and maybe that's a place of privilege because of all that advocacy. I don't know, but we should give those folks their credit before potentially critiquing them. And with that, I think we have to end, but thank you all so much for your patience.